So with the recent release of Sonic X Shadow Generations on modern hardware, I got excited telling my partner how I've played the original game front to back. Then it dawned on me, I have never beaten Sonic Generations for the 3DS, a game often forgotten when the topic of Sonic Generations comes up. The 3DS version was released back in 2011 alongside the original game when I was only 10 years old.
What do you mean it's been 13 years?
I had no prior experience with this game before making this video, other than hearing it mentioned in passing. So I knew things like the first 3 stage layouts being pretty much one-to-one with the originals in classic Sonic's case. I also know that this game gets bashed pretty often, at least from my anecdotal experience, with it often being written off as just an inferior handheld port, if anyone even bothers to remember it. So before this game is forgotten, let's run through the 3DS version of Sonic Generations.
It's important to mention that this game was created by Dimps, the same people who created the Sonic Advance and Sonic Rush trilogy. And while I like these games well enough, they have some level design that holds them back, so let's hope Dimps learn from their mistakes with this game.
Anyway, getting into the actual game itself, the story here in Sonic Generations 3DS is exactly the same as the console original, with some interactions being replicated word for word. However, this is probably the single worst way you could experience this story, as everything takes place with still models and random JPEGs of items or characters. For example, the Chaos Emeralds are just really out of place pictures on the screen and not modeled when they come up in story cutscenes. It's not like Generations had a great story anyways, so I guess not much is lost, but this is the worst way to experience an already shallow story. The gameplay also starts like its console counterpart, where after the title screen it throws you straight into Green Hill Zone just like the classic games. Classic Sonic controls fine enough, but still not as good as the classic games, and seeing as the first 3 stages are just classic Sonic stages, they're also great. Next up is Modern Sonic, and he has all the moves you'd expect him to have, like the boost and the homing attack, and the stomp, which he learns after the second part of the game for some reason. They're both in 2D, so you might feel like it's redundant to have 2 2D Sonics, and you'd be kinda right, however I'd argue that they're distinct enough. Classic Sonic is very satisfying to get to full speed. Sure, these levels genuinely never reach the heights of the classic games, but they do have a sense of flow to them. Dimps being Dimps, however, that flow can get interrupted abruptly sometimes by random obstacles made even harder to react from what feels like a very crunched screen. It got easier by the end of the game though, so maybe I'm just bitch-made. However, Modern Sonic is different as his boost allows him to get to full speed easily, but he's much more cinematic and exhilarating with dynamic camera angles and genuinely imaginative set pieces. In a funny way, I'd compare it to classic Sonic's spin dash in the console game. In that version, classic Sonic can fire himself across the level almost effortlessly, and while some people say it's too overpowered or detracts from the levels, I think it's fun and provides 2 similar yet distinct design philosophies. Classic Sonic is slower, but his speed feels earned and satisfying, like a reward for playing well, and Modern Sonic is faster since he can just press a button and go zoom, but his sense of speed can launch him across the screen to make up for what might be less involved level design. Could these design philosophies have just been combined? Sure, yeah, 100%, but it's not an awful way to serve the whole 2 Sonics idea. After the first zone alternating between these 2 blue bastards, we get a special stage. No! If you've been with the franchise long enough to recognize these stages from Sonic Heroes, then you probably remember they controlled like utter dog shit. Seriously, touching the control stick once sent a group of mammals flying straight into a minefield in that game.
We're Sonic Heroes!
However, they're not actually bad here at all. They're not something you come back to time and time again, but they're not awful to control, and I love the music. It's fun to just go zoom sometimes, and after finishing these stages, you get a Chaos Emerald so you can just move right on.
In the first section you play in Green Hill from Sonic 1, then Casino Night from 16-bit Sonic 2, and lastly Mushroom Hill from Sonic and Knuckles or Sonic 3 and Knuckles depending on who you ask. I'm more of a Sonic 3 and Knuckles kind of guy.
After tearing through 3 stages as both Blue Rats and acquiring 3 Chaos Emeralds, we get to a boss area with 2 separate stages. The first boss stage is always a race in these areas, and the second boss stage is a normal boss fight. In this instance, classic Sonic needs to race Metal Sonic like the console games, and then he fights Big Arm from Sonic 3, and that's all for him in terms of boss fights for the rest of the entire game. No, seriously, it's only Modern Sonic from here on out for boss fights. They added the Bio Lizard from Sonic Adventure 2, which is really cool, but it would have been cool to let classic Sonic fight this guy. Anyway, I think having a race replace the rival fights is a really good idea for this game, as it was likely meant to call back to Sonic Rivals 1 and 2 on the PSP. These handheld-only titles had Sonic pit against his friends in one-on-one races like these. However, as much as I like the idea, these races are unfortunately pretty shallow, so including elements from the Sonic Rivals titles like power-ups or the ability to attack your opponent directly would have made these a bit better. Another thing I think would have been better would have been touching on Sonic's handheld history more. I like Mushroom Hill and Casino Night as much as the next guy, but imagine if we got stages from 8-bit Sonic 1, 8-bit Sonic 2, and Sonic Triple Trouble instead. It would have gone a long way to giving this game its own identity by allowing it to represent a completely different side of Sonic than the console version does. Hey yo, where's my Sonic Blast representation? After beating that section of the game, Classic Sonic learns the homing attack for some reason. Listen, in the console games, Classic Sonic could earn the homing attack after getting all the red star rings. It was a cool bonus that changed up his moveset. In this game, it kinda just serves to homogenize the two Sonics. They're already extremely similar anyways because they're both in 2D, so this wasn't a great addition in my opinion. Dimps also just lines up enemies pretty often to be nothing more than homing attack targets, and now they can just do that in every stage instead of just letting modern Sonic do that. Moving on, we go through Emerald Coast and Radical Highway. And listen, again, I love Sonic Adventure 2 as much as the next guy, but Sonic didn't even go through Radical Highway. That was Shadow. However, Classic Sonic's version of Emerald Coast genuinely had me smiling from ear to ear. A lot of these stages in the game are either complete rips or just not up to the quality of the console version due to some level design choices. However, with Classic Sonic's Emerald Coast, it was essentially the original 3D stage from Sonic Adventure turned into a 2D Classic Sonic level. You start by the hotel just like in Sonic Adventure, moving your way through the stage seeing the lighthouse and Orca chase scene just from a 2D perspective. None of the other stages quite capture this magic, however. Not to say the other stages are bad, just that this one was my favorite. Even then, the actual level design isn't perfect, but it just stands out so much because of the set pieces. Modern Sonic then races Shadow and dunks on him before moving on and fighting the Bio-Lizard. Nothing crazy about these boss fights, but it's kinda a shame that the rival races don't get their own stages. Maybe it was to save space on these tiny cartridges since the boss fights get their own proper stages. After all of that, the Sonics finally get to a level that originated on a handheld with Water Palace. The music is so good, but I'd argue it was one of my least favorite stages in the entire game on Classic Sonic's end. Funnily enough, the only portable stage from this game is the worst one, and of course it had to be a water level. The Sonics then move on to Tropical Resort, which actually ended up being one of my favorite stages here for both Hedgehogs. The Wisp powers they chose for Classic Sonic kept the speed going, but provided some uniqueness to the level, and for Modern Sonic, this level was exhilarating to catch some air in after chaining a Laser Wisp and Boost together. Although I did launch myself into a pit multiple times doing that. Now earlier I said the only handheld based level was Water Palace, but technically I think this is based on the DS version of this level from the Rush trilogy, but that barely counts in my eyes. We also race Silver here. Poor Silver, you haven't had a chance to do shit since 06. And after racing Silver, Sonic fights Eggman and the Egg Emperor for some reason, despite there being absolutely zero Sonic Heroes representation in this game whatsoever. Just like in the console version, you're forced to collect the Chaos Emeralds as you progress through the story, so the final boss is a Super Sonic fight just like the console version too. And just like the console version, this is easily, and I mean easily, the worst part of the game by far. Classic Sonic's half of the fight is dodging the same attacks over and over again, waiting for the time meter to expose his core, which is painfully boring and only gets longer with each phase, and Modern Sonic's phase requires him to boost into the time meter to try and hit his core. Modern Sonic's part here is just annoying, since he will attempt to smack you back with his hands, but it's so finicky whether it wants to accept your dodge input or not. Anyway, after trudging through that boss fight, you finish the game. In my case, it took around 2 hours, but I'm absolutely positive you could beat it in under that. Unfortunately though, you don't unlock Super Sonic in normal stages at all, which is really lame. So after 2 hours, what's the verdict? I think this game is actually pretty underrated, although it has issues. The stage selection is plain bizarre for excluding handheld levels as much as it did. The level design can be homogeneous, especially once Classic Sonic gets the homing attack, and I think these levels just lack the substance and replayability of the classic titles, or even some of Sonic's better modern titles. They're not as dense or explorable as the stages in its console counterpart either. I also think this game would have benefited from an extra stage or two. I think the short runtime of this game actually gives it some replayability, but I could have definitely gone with an extra stage that would have allowed it to carve more of its own identity.
Looking past those shortcomings, you get a decent game with decent level design that gives you some of that Sonic speed on the go. The graphics are nice enough, and the game doesn't control like complete dog shit, which is saying a lot for the Sonic franchise. I think this game is far better than the reputation it got. I can certainly say it's underrated, but I can also certainly say it's not going to be winning awards anytime soon. This game is no shallow console tie-in, however, and I think there's merit to playing this, especially if it's for a first playthrough. There's just not much to keep you coming back. This game definitely doesn't deserve the hate, or to just be written off as an inferior console port. There was actual effort put here, and sure, it's not going to blow your socks off, but it's worth a try as well. You could do a lot worse, you could also do a lot better though.
Thanks so much to everyone who stopped by for this video. I'm definitely having more fun making these random YouTube videos, so leave a like if you want to see more. Don't forget to drop your suggestions for games I should cover down below, and join me next time where I calculate how much fentanyl Sonic can do before he die. Later.